the most brutal crimes of the Islamic Caliphates that no one dared to talk about. The leader who would guide the growing community of Muslims was no longer among them, and the people looked for someone who could both honor the teachings of the Prophet and lead the community in a time of rapid change. This period marked the beginning of the Islamic Caliphates, a series of governments led by caliphs who were tasked with maintaining order, guiding religious practice, and expanding the influence of Islam. The first of these leaders, Abu Bakr, emerged as a figure of stability. He was known for his wisdom and dedication to the principles of Islam, and the people trusted him to navigate the challenges of the early Islamic community. However, the early caliphates were not just a time of religious guidance. They were also a time of political complexity and military ambition. As the community grew, so did the need to control distant lands, protect borders, and manage rivalries both inside and outside the Islamic world. The first caliphs faced not only the challenge of preserving the unity of the Muslim community, but also the pressure of securing their territories from those who resisted their rule. Abu Bakr and later Umar, Uthman and Ali had to make difficult decisions that often involved the use of force. These decisions were justified as necessary for the survival of the community, but they also set the stage for some of the more controversial and harsh actions that history would record. During this period, the Islamic caliphates expanded rapidly. They moved into lands that had long histories and complex societies, including Persia, the Levant, and North Africa. The speed of these conquests was remarkable, and the military strategies employed were effective in bringing large territories under control. The caliphs were determined to spread their influence, both politically and religiously, and the expansion was seen by many as a sign of divine favor. Yet, alongside these achievements were instances of severe actions against those who resisted. Cities that refused to submit could face destruction, and populations were sometimes punished to ensure compliance. These actions, though often recorded in historical texts, were rarely discussed openly in later centuries, leaving a shadow over the accomplishments of the early caliphates. The expansion was not purely about conquest. It was also about governance and the establishment of order. The caliphs needed to implement systems to collect taxes, maintain security, and integrate diverse populations into the Islamic framework. This required both diplomacy and force. In some cases, local leaders were allowed to maintain authority under the condition that they recognized the caliph's power and adhered to certain laws. In other cases, those who resisted faced imprisonment, exile, or more severe punishments. The balance between mercy and harshness was delicate, and the decisions made by the caliphs reflected the challenges of ruling a rapidly growing empire. One of the most striking aspects of this period was the contrast between ideals and reality. The teachings of Islam emphasized justice, compassion, and the protection of the weak, yet the political and military pressures of the time often led to actions that were harsh or brutal. The caliphs believed that these actions were necessary to maintain unity and security, but they also created fear and resentment among those who experienced them. Scholars and historians have noted that this tension between principle and practice was a defining feature of the early caliphates. The leaders were committed to their religious and political goals, but the methods they used to achieve them sometimes conflicted with the values they espoused. The story of the first caliphs also reveals the human side of leadership. Abu Bakr, for example, faced opposition from tribes that questioned his authority, yet he managed to maintain loyalty through a combination of diplomacy, strategic marriages, and military campaigns. Umar, his successor, was known for his strict sense of justice, but he could also be ruthless in dealing with those who threatened the community. Uthman faced criticism for favoring certain families and regions, which eventually led to unrest and his assassination. Ali, the fourth caliph, struggled to maintain unity during a time of intense civil conflict, known as the First Fitna, where Muslims fought against one another in battles over leadership. These stories show that the early caliphs were not only political figures, but also individuals who had to navigate personal challenges, rivalries, and the expectations of a growing religious community. The period also brought about significant changes in social structures. As the Islamic Caliphates expanded, they encountered societies with established traditions, local leaders, and existing religious practices. The caliphs needed to manage these differences carefully, blending respect for local customs with the introduction of Islamic laws and practices. This sometimes led to tension and conflict, especially when populations resisted changes or challenged the authority of the caliph. In some regions, communities were allowed to continue their traditions under supervision, while in others, harsh measures were used to enforce compliance. This balancing act required constant attention and often resulted in difficult decisions that could affect thousands of lives. Education and scholarship also played a role in shaping the early caliphates. The caliphs encouraged learning, the recording of history, and the development of religious scholarship to guide future generations. Libraries were established, scholars were supported, and the principles of Islamic law were documented and studied. At the same time, this era produced records of military campaigns, political decisions, and administrative measures, many of which contained accounts of actions that were severe or controversial. These historical texts provide valuable insights into the realities of the time, showing both the accomplishments and the darker sides of leadership. The early caliphates were also a time of cultural exchange. As Muslim armies moved into new territories, they encountered different languages, traditions, and knowledge systems. This led to the introduction of new ideas in science, medicine, architecture, and governance. While the caliphs often sought to unify their empire under Islamic principles, they also benefited from the contributions of the peoples they governed. However, this cultural interaction was sometimes accompanied by tension and conflict, especially when local populations resisted integration or when military campaigns resulted in loss of life and property. In summary, the first period of the Islamic Caliphates was marked by rapid expansion, political complexity, and the constant challenge of balancing ideals with practical realities. The leaders of this time faced enormous responsibilities, including maintaining unity, enforcing laws, and managing diverse populations. Their actions included both remarkable achievements and harsh measures that would later be remembered as controversial. While history often celebrates the expansion and governance of the caliphates, it is also important to recognize the human cost of these decisions. The early caliphs were not perfect. They were leaders navigating a world filled with political, military, and social challenges, trying to guide a growing community while facing pressures from both within and outside their territories. This period set the stage for what was to come in later years. The methods used to consolidate power, expand territory, and enforce compliance would leave lasting impressions on the regions under caliphate rule. While some actions were remembered as necessary for survival and unity, others were quietly recorded as brutal or controversial, creating a complex legacy. The story of the early Islamic caliphates is therefore a story of ambition, faith, leadership, and the difficult choices that come with power, a story that blends remarkable achievements with actions that many would later struggle to discuss openly. After the early caliphs had established a sense of stability in the heartlands of the Islamic community, their attention turned outward. The world around them was filled with empires, kingdoms, and city-states, each with its own culture, religion, and power structures. The Islamic caliphates, now growing in confidence and resources, embarked on a series of military campaigns to expand their influence. These campaigns were often called wars of conquest, but they were not simply acts of aggression. They were complex operations, blending diplomacy, strategy, and, at times, force as the caliphs sought to bring new territories under their rule while maintaining the unity and strength of the growing Muslim community. The first major campaigns were in the regions surrounding the Arabian Peninsula. Neighboring tribes and communities had long resisted centralized authority, and the caliphs sought to unify these lands under a single political and religious framework. Abu Bakr, the first caliph, launched efforts to bring rebellious tribes into compliance, sometimes through negotiation and sometimes through military action. These early campaigns demonstrated both the determination of the caliphate and the challenges of leading a diverse and often divided population. The balance between persuasion and force was delicate, as the caliphs had to avoid alienating the people they wished to govern while also asserting their authority. Under Caliph Umar, the Islamic Caliphate expanded far beyond the Arabian Peninsula. The campaigns reached the territories of the Sasanian Empire in Persia and the Byzantine Empire in the Levant and North Africa. These were powerful empires with long histories, strong armies, and established cities. Yet the Muslim armies, motivated by a combination of religious zeal, political ambition, and the promise of security and justice under Islamic law, were able to achieve remarkable success. The battles were intense and required careful planning. The caliphs relied on generals and local commanders to lead their forces, using strategies that allowed them to overcome numerically superior enemies and challenging terrain. While the military campaigns were often successful, they were not without consequences. Cities that resisted the caliphate faced harsh measures to ensure that the message of compliance was clear. Populations were sometimes required to pay taxes, give up weapons, or accept new leadership. In some cases, local rulers who refused to surrender were removed from power, and their families faced imprisonment or exile. These measures were justified by the caliphs as necessary to maintain order, but they also created fear and resentment. Historical accounts suggest that some communities felt the weight of these decisions more than others, and the memory of these events would linger for generations. The sieges of major cities were particularly significant. A siege was not simply a military tactic, it was a test of endurance, patience, and strategy. Armies would surround a city, cutting off supplies and waiting for the inhabitants to surrender. The goal was often to minimize bloodshed by forcing a city to submit peacefully, but if resistance persisted, the consequences could be severe. Historical texts describe instances where cities were carefully examined. Populations were given choices to surrender or face further consequences, and sometimes, after long sieges, the military took control with decisive measures. These accounts reveal the dual nature of conquest, the desire to expand influence while also asserting authority and control in a way that would prevent further rebellion. One of the notable campaigns was the conquest of Persia. The Sasanian Empire had been a dominant power for centuries, and its defeat was a major turning point in the region. Muslim armies engaged in several battles, using strategies that combined mobility, intelligence, and careful planning. The caliphate's ability to coordinate large forces across long distances was remarkable. At the same time, the campaigns required difficult decisions. Leaders had to consider not only the immediate outcome of a battle, but also the long-term effects on the population, infrastructure, and political stability of the conquered regions. The success in Persia opened the way for further expansion into Central Asia and laid the foundation for centuries of Islamic influence in the area. In the West, the Byzantine territories in Syria, Egypt, and North Africa presented different challenges. These regions were rich in resources and had well-fortified cities, but internal divisions within the Byzantine Empire sometimes made conquest easier. Muslim commanders were able to negotiate with local leaders, promising security and religious freedom for those who accepted the caliphate's authority. In other cases, resistance led to prolonged campaigns and, occasionally, destruction of parts of a city to establish control. These actions were recorded in historical texts, often with an emphasis on the strategic necessity of the measures rather than on the suffering involved. The wars of conquest were also shaped by the caliphate's need to maintain internal unity. As armies moved into new territories, it was essential that soldiers and commanders remained loyal to the central authority. This required strict discipline, careful oversight, and sometimes harsh punishment for those who disobeyed orders. Leaders understood that any sign of weakness could be exploited by enemies or rebellious factions. At the same time, they needed to win the trust of local populations. In many cases, communities that had been brought under caliphate rule benefited from increased security, organized governance, and opportunities for trade and cultural exchange. The complexity of conquest lay in balancing the use of force with the need to build lasting stability. The human cost of these campaigns was significant, though it is often described in neutral or matter-of-fact terms in historical texts. Soldiers faced danger and fatigue, populations faced displacement or the demands of new rulers, and cities experienced disruption to daily life. While some accounts highlight the victories and achievements of the caliphate, others provide glimpses of the suffering that accompanied these events. It is clear that the expansion of the Islamic Caliphates was not without challenges and hardships, both for the conquerors and for those being governed. Religious motivation played an important role in these campaigns, but it was intertwined with political and strategic goals. The spread of Islam was central to the caliph's vision, yet they also sought to create political unity and administrative control. In conquered territories, the caliphs often allowed local religious practices to continue, provided that the population acknowledged the authority of the caliph and complied with certain regulations. This approach was both practical and strategic, helping to reduce resistance while establishing the presence of the caliphate. However, when communities resisted, stricter measures were sometimes applied. These decisions were recorded as part of the historical record, showing the tension between religious ideals and the demands of governance. Trade and economic considerations were another important factor in the wars of conquest. The caliphate sought control over key trade routes, fertile lands, and strategic cities. By securing these areas, the caliphs could ensure resources for their growing population, support for their armies, and stability within their territories. The economic dimension of conquest influenced decisions about which cities to target, how to administer them, and how to integrate local populations into the caliphate's systems of taxation and governance. The combination of military, political, religious, and economic objectives made the wars of conquest complex and multifaceted. Despite the challenges and hardships, the wars of conquest had lasting consequences. The territories brought under the caliphate's rule became centers of Islamic culture, learning, and administration. Cities that had once resisted were transformed into hubs of trade, scholarship, and religious activity. The achievements of these campaigns were remarkable, not only in terms of territorial expansion, but also in the creation of a new political and cultural order. At the same time, the methods used to achieve these results left a mark on the collective memory of the people involved, creating stories of both triumph and hardship that would be remembered for generations. In conclusion, the wars of conquest during the early Islamic caliphates were more than just battles for land. They were campaigns shaped by strategy, diplomacy, religion, and the demands of leadership. The caliphs and their commanders faced complex challenges, including the need to maintain unity, manage diverse populations, and secure resources for their growing empire. While victories were celebrated and new territories were incorporated into the caliphate, the campaigns also brought difficulties, disruptions, and hardships for many people. The history of these wars reveals a world where ambition, faith, and power intersected, creating both opportunities and challenges. It is a story of determination, leadership, and the human cost of expansion, a story that reminds us that the growth of empires is never simple or without consequence. After the Islamic Caliphates had expanded their territories through wars of conquest, a new set of challenges emerged, those from within. While the external campaigns had brought new lands and wealth, they also exposed differences among the leaders, soldiers, and communities within the caliphate itself. The unity that the early caliphs had worked hard to establish began to show signs of strain, as political rivalries, personal ambitions, and disagreements over leadership led to tensions that sometimes erupted into violent conflicts. These internal struggles would shape the course of the caliphates and leave a lasting mark on the history of the Islamic world. The period following Caliph Uthman's leadership was particularly tense. Uthman had been the third caliph, and while his reign saw continued expansion and administrative development, it was also marked by growing discontent. Many people accused him of favoring certain families and regions, creating an impression that wealth and power were concentrated among a few elites. Complaints arose from soldiers, scholars, and ordinary citizens alike, who felt that the caliphate was drifting away from the principles of justice and equality that had been emphasized during the leadership of Abu Bakr and Umar. These grievances created a climate of unrest, and ultimately they contributed to one of the most dramatic events in early Islamic history, the assassination of Caliph Uthman. The assassination of Uthman was a turning point. It shocked the Muslim community and plunged the caliphate into a period of uncertainty. Leaders and citizens alike were forced to confront questions of legitimacy, loyalty, and authority. Who had the right to lead? How could the community remain united after such a divisive event? These questions were not merely theoretical. They had immediate consequences for governance, military strategy, and the safety of the population. Ali, the cousin and son-in-law of Prophet Muhammad, was eventually chosen as the fourth caliph, but his ascension was far from smooth. His leadership was immediately challenged by factions who had opposed Uthman, as well as those who had previously supported him. This period of internal struggle is known in history as the First Fitna, or the First Civil War of the Muslim community. The Fitna involved several key battles, including the Battle of Jamal and the Battle of Siffin. These battles were fought between groups of Muslims, each believing that they were acting in the best interest of the community. The fighting was intense and sometimes brutal, as both sides sought to assert their claim to leadership. Ordinary citizens often found themselves caught in the middle, facing disruption to daily life, displacement, or the demands of supporting one side or the other. The internal conflicts revealed that the challenges of leadership were not only external, managing territories and armies, but also deeply personal and political. The tensions of this period were not limited to military action. Political maneuvering, alliances, and rivalries played a critical role. Leaders sought to gain support by negotiating with influential families, tribal leaders, and local governors. Promises were made, loyalties were tested, and at times, threats were used to secure compliance. These strategies were often necessary to maintain order and ensure the survival of the caliphate, but they also highlighted the fragility of unity in a rapidly growing empire. The delicate balance between persuasion, negotiation, and the potential use of force became a defining feature of this period, as leaders worked to consolidate power while avoiding further fragmentation. Religious disagreements also fueled internal tensions. Different interpretations of Islamic law, governance, and leadership principles contributed to the divisions. Some groups believed that leadership should be based on strict religious qualification, while others emphasized familial or tribal ties. These differences, while theological in nature, had immediate political consequences. Leaders needed to navigate these disputes carefully, balancing respect for religious principles with the practical demands of ruling a diverse population. Failure to do so could result in rebellion, loss of support, or even civil war. The human cost of these internal struggles was significant. Families were divided, communities were disrupted, and cities experienced the presence of armies and conflict. Historical accounts describe battles where citizens were forced to choose sides, sometimes against their will, and where the outcomes of political disputes could affect their safety, property, and freedom. Leaders were aware of these consequences, yet they often believed that decisive action was necessary to preserve the caliphate and prevent further chaos. The tension between moral responsibility and political necessity was a recurring theme during this period, showing the complexity of governing an empire under pressure. One of the most challenging aspects of leadership during the fitna was managing the loyalty of the military. Armies were composed of soldiers from different regions, tribes, and backgrounds, each with their own interests and expectations. Commanders needed to maintain discipline, prevent defections, and ensure that soldiers remained committed to the central authority. This required careful strategy, clear communication, and sometimes the use of strict measures to enforce order. The caliphs also had to consider the morale of their forces, as discontent among soldiers could quickly translate into rebellion or the loss of territory. Despite the internal conflict, the period also saw moments of remarkable leadership and attempts at reconciliation. Ali, in particular, sought to address grievances through dialogue, consultation with scholars, and efforts to establish fair governance. He recognized that the survival of the caliphate depended not only on military strength, but also on the loyalty and trust of the population. Efforts were made to resolve disputes, implement justice, and create a sense of unity, even amid ongoing challenges. These attempts, though sometimes only partially successful, demonstrated a commitment to the ideals of leadership and the importance of balancing authority with fairness. The first fitna also influenced the development of Islamic law and political thought. Scholars observed the events, recorded their accounts, and analyzed the decisions made by leaders. The Civil War raised questions about legitimacy, justice, and the responsibilities of those in power. These discussions would shape future generations' understanding of governance, leadership, and the ethical challenges of ruling an empire. The internal conflicts of this period were not merely historical events. They became lessons in strategy, law, and human behavior, offering insights into the complexity of leadership in a rapidly changing world. Another important aspect of the internal struggles was the role of local leaders and communities. Governors, tribal chiefs, and city officials had to navigate the demands of the central caliphate while addressing the needs and concerns of their populations. In many cases, these local leaders acted as intermediaries, negotiating compromises and enforcing decisions. However, when loyalties were divided or when leaders acted independently, conflicts could escalate. The caliphs needed to maintain oversight while also respecting local authority, creating a delicate balance that required skill, patience, and sometimes tough decisions. The impact of these internal struggles extended beyond the political and military spheres. Social and economic life was affected as communities dealt with the disruptions caused by battles, political purges, and shifting alliances. Trade could be interrupted, taxes could be altered, and ordinary people often bore the burden of political decisions. The first fitna and related conflicts revealed how closely interconnected the political, social, and economic aspects of the caliphate were, showing that leadership decisions had wide-ranging consequences for all levels of society. In many ways, the internal struggles of the caliphate highlighted the challenges of balancing idealism with practicality. Leaders were guided by religious principles, political necessity, and the desire to maintain unity. At times, these goals aligned, leading to effective governance and stability. At other times, conflicts between ideals and reality produced tension, unrest, and even violence. The decisions made by the caliphs and their advisors during this period demonstrate the complexity of leadership in a society that was growing rapidly in size, diversity, and influence. Despite the difficulties, the early caliphates continued to develop systems of governance, law, and administration. Efforts were made to create fair taxation systems, establish courts, and provide security for citizens. Even during periods of conflict, the caliphs sought to maintain the institutions necessary for a functioning state. These efforts laid the foundation for later generations, showing that even amid internal struggles, the caliphate could endure, adapt, and continue to grow. In conclusion, the internal power struggles of the early Islamic caliphates were a defining feature of the period following the deaths of the first few caliphs. Civil war, political rivalries, religious disputes, and challenges to leadership created tension and conflict, affecting both the leaders and the population at large. At the same time, these struggles demonstrated the complexity of leadership, the difficulty of maintaining unity in a diverse empire, and the human consequences of political decisions. The first fitna and related conflicts left a lasting legacy, shaping the development of Islamic governance, law, and historical thought. They remind us that the history of the caliphates is not only a story of expansion and conquest, but also a story of human ambition, loyalty, and the constant challenge of balancing power with principle. As the Islamic caliphates continued to expand their territories and manage internal struggles, another important aspect of their rule came into focus: governance, social policies, and the management of diverse populations. The caliphs were responsible not only for leading armies and maintaining political authority, but also for overseeing the day-to-day lives of millions of people across vast lands. These lands were culturally, religiously, and socially diverse, including communities that had long-standing traditions, languages, and governance systems. The challenge for the caliphs was to integrate these populations into the caliphate while maintaining order and supporting the growth of Islam. Religious and social policies were central to the caliphate's governance. The caliphs sought to unify their territories under a common legal and religious framework, which included the implementation of Islamic law. This process required careful administration and oversight. In many areas, local customs were respected, provided that they did not conflict with the basic principles of the caliphate. However, in some regions, resistance to Islamic rule or refusal to pay taxes prompted stricter measures. These actions were seen by the caliphs as necessary to preserve authority and ensure stability, even when they were difficult for local communities to accept. One significant challenge was managing religious minorities. The caliphates ruled over populations that included Christians, Jews, Zoroastrians, and other groups with their own faith traditions. The caliphs often allowed these communities to continue practicing their religion, provided they paid a special tax, known as the jizya, and recognized the authority of the caliph. This policy was intended to maintain peace and order, while also emphasizing the supremacy of Islamic governance. While many communities accepted these terms, there were instances where resistance led to stricter enforcement or military action. These policies reflect the caliph's attempt to balance religious tolerance with political control. Social hierarchies were also affected by the policies of the caliphates. Leaders sought to establish clear systems of taxation, land ownership, and legal authority. Local governors were appointed to oversee cities and regions, ensuring that the central authority of the caliph was respected. In some cases, this led to friction between local populations and new administrators, especially if previous systems of governance were disrupted. The caliphs recognized the importance of maintaining the support of influential families and tribal leaders, often negotiating agreements that allowed these leaders to retain a degree of power while accepting the authority of the caliphate. Education and scholarship were encouraged as part of governance. The caliphs supported the development of schools, libraries, and centers of learning, believing that educated citizens and officials were essential for a functioning state. Scholars were tasked with interpreting Islamic law, advising leaders, and recording history. These institutions also helped integrate diverse populations by providing a shared framework of knowledge and law. At the same time, the promotion of education and scholarship helped to legitimize the authority of the caliphate, as the leaders were seen as patrons of learning and culture. Despite efforts at governance and tolerance, the caliphate sometimes had to take harsh measures to maintain order. Rebellions, refusal to pay taxes, or attacks on caliphate authorities were met with firm responses. These measures could include imprisonment of leaders, fines, or military action to suppress unrest. Historical records often describe these actions in neutral terms, focusing on their necessity for maintaining stability. From the perspective of the caliphs, these actions were not arbitrary. They were part of the difficult task of ruling a large and diverse empire where loyalty and compliance were essential for survival. The implementation of justice was a constant concern for the caliphs. Islamic law provided a framework for courts, judges, and legal processes. The caliphs aimed to ensure that disputes were resolved fairly and that criminals were held accountable. In some cases, this involved setting examples to prevent future disobedience. While the legal system was based on principles of fairness, the reality of governing vast territories sometimes required swift and decisive action. Balancing justice with practical necessity was a challenge that required careful judgment and careful delegation to trusted officials. Economic policies also played a role in maintaining control. The caliphs needed to ensure that cities and regions were productive, taxes were collected efficiently, and trade routes remained secure. These measures provided resources for armies, public works, and administration. They also helped integrate conquered populations into the economic structure of the caliphate. However, when economic demands were perceived as excessive or unfair, they could lead to unrest. The caliphs had to continually adjust policies to maintain both stability and prosperity, demonstrating the complexity of governance in a growing empire. The caliphates also invested in infrastructure to strengthen their rule. Roads, bridges, water systems, and city defenses were built or improved to support trade, communication, and security. These projects benefited local populations, making daily life more stable, while also facilitating the movement of armies and administrators. Investments in infrastructure were a practical tool for maintaining control, showing that the caliphs were not only military leaders, but also administrators who understood the importance of long-term development. Cultural integration was another important goal. The caliphates encouraged the exchange of ideas, art, and knowledge between different regions. While military conquest brought new territories under Islamic rule, the caliphs also recognized the value of learning from the peoples they governed. Libraries, translation efforts, and the promotion of scholarship helped bring together knowledge from Persia, the Byzantine Empire, and other regions. This cultural blending strengthened the empire and helped establish centers of learning that would influence the Islamic world for centuries. While these policies often succeeded in creating order and stability, they were not always universally welcomed. Resistance occurred when populations felt that their traditions, economic interests, or local authority were being undermined. The caliphs faced the constant challenge of responding to unrest without causing widespread resentment. Leaders had to carefully weigh the consequences of each decision, balancing firmness with diplomacy and punishment with incentives for cooperation. This constant balancing act defined the nature of governance in the early caliphates. The human aspect of these policies should not be overlooked. Ordinary people were affected by taxation, legal rulings, and administrative decisions. Communities had to adapt to new rulers, new systems of law, and sometimes new religious expectations. While some populations benefited from improved security, infrastructure, and governance, others felt the weight of political authority and were compelled to adjust their way of life. The decisions of the caliphs, though often aimed at the good of the empire, had real consequences for individuals and families across the regions they governed. In many cases, the caliphs relied on advisors, scholars, and governors to implement policies. This delegation of authority was essential for managing such a vast empire, but it also created challenges. Mismanagement, corruption, or local disputes could undermine central authority. Leaders had to remain vigilant, ensuring that their policies were enforced fairly and that local officials acted in the best interest of the community. The success of governance often depended on the skill and integrity of these intermediaries, highlighting the interconnected nature of leadership, administration, and local support. The approach of the caliphs to governance demonstrates a consistent theme: the need to balance ideals with practicality. The caliphs sought to uphold Islamic principles, maintain justice, and support learning, while also managing political authority, economic resources, and social order. This balancing act required constant attention, careful judgment, and sometimes difficult decisions. The caliphs were aware that their actions would have lasting effects on the people they governed, and they sought to create systems that could endure beyond their own lifetimes. In conclusion, the period of governance and social management in the Islamic Caliphates highlights the complexity of ruling a vast, diverse empire. The caliphs faced the dual challenge of maintaining authority and integrating populations with different cultures, religions, and traditions. Their policies toward minorities, legal systems, economic structures, and infrastructure demonstrate an effort to create stability, fairness, and long-term prosperity. At the same time, the decisions they made, sometimes firm or strict, had real consequences for individuals and communities. This period shows that leadership in the caliphates was not only about military conquest or political power, but also about the careful management of society, the balance of ideals with reality, and the human impact of governance. It is a story of administration, culture, and the continuing effort to build an empire that could endure through both challenges and change. As the Islamic Caliphates continued to grow and evolve, their influence extended far beyond military conquests, internal struggles, and social governance. The legacy of their rule became one of both remarkable achievement and complex consequences. The decisions made by the caliphs, the policies they implemented, and the ways they managed diverse populations left lasting effects on the lands and people under their control. Yet much of this history remained unspoken or minimized in later centuries, creating a sense of silence around some of the more difficult aspects of their reign. Understanding this legacy requires a careful look at the social, political, and cultural impact of the caliphates, as well as the reasons why certain events were not widely discussed in historical narratives. One of the most significant aspects of the caliphate's legacy was the political and administrative systems they established. The expansion of territories required more than military victories. It demanded organized governance. The caliphs implemented structured systems for taxation, law, and public administration. Governors were appointed to manage provinces, ensuring that the authority of the central caliph was maintained. These officials oversaw justice, collected revenues, and coordinated local administration. The organization of the empire allowed it to function effectively despite its size, connecting distant regions under a common framework. This system became a model for later Islamic states and influenced governance in the broader region for centuries. Legal and religious institutions were another enduring legacy. The caliphs encouraged the codification of Islamic law, which provided a framework for justice, personal conduct, and community relations. Scholars and judges worked to interpret and apply these laws consistently across different regions, ensuring that people understood their rights and responsibilities. By creating a shared legal and religious structure, the caliphates not only unified their territories, but also reinforced the authority of the state. This dual focus on law and religion helped maintain social cohesion while allowing diverse communities to function under a common system of rules. The cultural impact of the caliphates was equally profound. As the empire expanded, it encountered and absorbed diverse cultures, languages, and traditions. This exchange led to a flourishing of knowledge, art, architecture, and scholarship. Libraries were built, texts were translated, and scholars from different backgrounds contributed to the development of science, philosophy, and literature. Cities such as Damascus, Baghdad, and Cairo became centers of learning and culture, attracting thinkers, artists, and merchants from across the known world. This blending of cultures not only enriched the Islamic world, but also influenced neighboring civilizations, leaving a lasting imprint on the intellectual and artistic heritage of the region. Despite these achievements, the caliphate's legacy also included more difficult and controversial aspects. Military campaigns, political purges, and strict governance sometimes caused suffering for individuals and communities. Cities that resisted central authority could face harsh measures, and ordinary people were often caught in the middle of political and military struggles. Religious minorities, while sometimes protected, were required to follow specific regulations and pay taxes that could be burdensome. These actions, while justified by the caliphs as necessary for order and unity, left a mark on the collective memory of affected communities. Over time, some of these events were downplayed or omitted from official histories, contributing to the sense of silence surrounding certain aspects of the caliphate's rule. The reasons for this historical silence are complex. Later chroniclers, scholars, and rulers often focused on the achievements of the caliphates, emphasizing military victories, administrative successes, and the spread of Islam. Difficult or controversial events, such as internal conflicts, strict punishments, and political rivalries, were sometimes minimized or framed in ways that highlighted necessity rather than consequence. This selective recording of history created a partial narrative, one that celebrated the accomplishments of the caliphates while leaving less discussed the human costs and challenges of governance. For modern historians, uncovering these less discussed events requires careful examination of diverse sources, including local records, poetry, letters, and accounts from outside observers. The impact of the caliphates' policies on future generations was significant. The administrative, legal, and educational systems they developed influenced the development of later Islamic states. Their emphasis on scholarship, learning, and cultural integration created intellectual traditions that persisted for centuries. At the same time, The internal conflicts and strict governance measures served as lessons for future rulers, demonstrating both the potential and the challenges of ruling a large and diverse empire. The successes and difficulties of the early caliphates became reference points for understanding power, justice, and social cohesion in the Islamic world. Trade and economic structures established during the caliphate period also had long-term effects. The security of trade routes, development of cities, and regulation of markets facilitated commerce across vast territories. Merchants, artisans, and farmers benefited from stable governance, while cities became hubs of exchange for goods, ideas, and culture. These economic developments contributed to the prosperity of the empire and helped integrate diverse regions into a shared economic system. The impact of these policies can still be seen in the historical development of trade networks and urban centers across the Middle East, North Africa, and beyond. The caliphates also left a complex religious legacy. While they expanded Islam and established a framework for its practice, they also faced challenges in managing differences among Muslim communities. Internal conflicts over leadership, interpretation of Islamic law, and religious authority shaped the development of Sunni and Shia traditions. The ways in which the caliphs managed these disputes influenced the evolution of religious thought and practice. This aspect of their legacy demonstrates how political authority, religious interpretation, and community cohesion were deeply intertwined in the Islamic world. Another important element of the caliphate's legacy was the way they demonstrated the human consequences of power and ambition. Leadership in such a large and diverse empire required difficult decisions, and even well-intentioned policies could have unintended consequences. Military campaigns, political purges, and strict enforcement of law were sometimes necessary to maintain stability. Yet they also affected ordinary people, creating fear, resentment, and sometimes loss. These experiences offer valuable lessons about the complexities of leadership, the responsibilities of those in power, and the impact of political decisions on everyday life. The historical narrative of the caliphates continues to be studied and debated today. Scholars examine both the achievements and the challenges, seeking a balanced understanding of this period. Modern historical research aims to uncover the experiences of ordinary people, explore the cultural and intellectual contributions of the era, and analyze the consequences of political and military actions. By studying the full scope of the caliphate's legacy, historians and readers gain insight into the ways in which ambition, governance, religion, and culture intersected to shape the Islamic world. In many ways, the story of the caliphates is a story of contrasts. It is a story of expansion and conquest alongside governance and administration, of intellectual achievement alongside social and political challenges, of religious guidance alongside human ambition. The complexity of their rule demonstrates that history is rarely simple or one-sided. The caliphates achieved remarkable things in governance, culture, and religion, yet their successes were accompanied by difficult decisions, internal conflicts, and consequences that affected millions of lives. Recognizing both the achievements and the challenges allows for a more complete understanding of their impact. Finally, the legacy of the Islamic caliphates serves as a reminder of the importance of history itself. While some events may have been downplayed or left unspoken, careful study allows us to see both the accomplishments and the struggles of the past. The caliphates shaped the political, cultural, and religious landscape of the Middle East and beyond, influencing future generations in ways that are still felt today. By examining their successes and difficulties, we gain insight into leadership, governance, human ambition, and the enduring impact of decisions made centuries ago. In conclusion, the Islamic caliphates left a legacy that is both impressive and complex. Their achievements in administration, law, culture, and trade shaped the regions they ruled and influenced the development of later societies. At the same time, internal conflicts, strict governance, and difficult decisions left a mark on the populations under their control. While some aspects of their history were minimized or silenced in later narratives, careful study reveals the full scope of their impact. The story of the Caliphates is thus a story of leadership, ambition, human experience, and the lasting consequences of power, an enduring chapter in the history of the world.